Hello and welcome to another installation in Floyd Zadkovich's presentation series. I'm happy to be speaking this morning, and this is probably a topic that we will continue to write on to speak about via videos as well as podcasts, and certainly in some written presentations and materials as we have been doing in the past. In particular, the topic is once again Venezuela and the situation in that country from the commercial and legal perspective. What is of interest today, and for purposes of this very short presentation, is the scope of some recent press reports describing that Mr. Wilbur Ross, the U.S. Secretary of Commerce, was this past week in Brazil, where he, at a presentation, explained that some dozen plus, actually 14 U.S. governmental agencies now have in place blueprints for a consolidated, coordinated plan on how to assist Venezuela with reconstruction, redevelopment, urgent humanitarian aid following a transition from the current regime to a contemplated new regime, namely that transition being envisioned as I would understand it, a shift from the Maduro regime to Mr. Guaido's regime. And reading those press reports triggered a consideration for me, which is that if U.S. governmental agencies already have in place their blueprints, their contingency plans for how to aid the Venezuelan people and the Venezuelan government following a transition, then would it not be prudent for commercial entities, particularly U.S. persons exposed to the scope of U.S. sanctions, for those commercial participants to also have in place, at least be given some thought to contingency plans on how to rapidly respond to a changed situation in Venezuela? What types of considerations would go into those contingency plans? Certainly there's a wide range, and it's a consideration I've been giving a good deal of thought to lately. But at the bare minimum, I see three top-level considerations. First and foremost, the limitations on commercial participants engaging in Venezuelan business without concern is largely driven by the sanction regime. And so I think factor number one on a contingency plan would be laying out a go-no-go list, go-no-go criteria for whether or not a particular business in a particular sector can re-engage with Venezuelan industry. What sanctions need to be lifted, what changes on the ground need to occur with respect to persons who currently may be in positions of power, both in the government and at business levels, but who may be designated as SDNs. Do they need to leave? What are those go-no-go criteria in terms of the rollback of sanctions and factual changes regarding the involvement of persons currently designated as SDNs before a business can comfortably get back into its sector in Venezuela? So step one, as I see it, certainly a list of go-no-go criteria. Step two is consideration of the financial security parameters. Talking about liens, talking about security interests, not talking about physical security, which is certainly a consideration that should play into factoring as well. But for purposes of financial security, I would expect that a large number of assets which might be the subject of renewed commercial activity in Venezuela are going to be burdened by a confusing and complex mess of pre-existing liens. Some of those liens, when you get into the maritime sector, being silent liens, as well as security interests that have been recorded. It could be a very confusing situation. And so thought should be given on the front end, I would encourage, to the due diligence steps that should be taken to assess whether or not particular assets might be burdened by pre-existing security interests, and how to potentially roll back those pre-existing security interests. The third step, certainly, is having the right people in place for commercial participants to give consideration to who their advisors are. Have those advisors been involved in the Venezuelan situation over the past several years? Have they followed it as it has developed? Are they knowledgeable about the U.S. sanctions regimes so that they can guide companies through the future rollback of those sanctions? And do they themselves have contacts in Venezuela, in other countries throughout Latin America and other regions that are important to Venezuela, so that a full team can be put together as needed? Those are some considerations that I have in mind. As far as timing, my thought is that it would not be the prudent move to wait too long before giving consideration to these contingency plans. I raise that because one could logically expect that some deals might get cut in the near future. There is already an alternative regime in Venezuela, and that regime has been recognized by a good number of countries around the world. So who knows what might be going on behind the scenes, what deals could already be getting inked. And so timing is important. I think that contingency planning should be conducted now or in the near future. And of course, one keeps an eye on the situation in Venezuela and hopes sincerely, most importantly, that the situation develops positively and peacefully for the Venezuelan people. I hope that you found this informative. Of course, we at Floyd Zadkovich would be delighted to speak further on a one-on-one basis, but wanted to get these thoughts out there. Thank you. Have a good day.